to answer that, I need to go back further to think about where I worked before, because in my previous job, we used psychometrics a lot. And over time, I became increasingly worried that the information I was gathering from the tests wasn't particularly helpful for schools and for parents, for teachers and for parents. And either I was confirming what they already knew, or I was telling them something different, which didn't fit with what they knew. And then they were just puzzled about what to do with that information. I didn't include any recommendations because these were seen as fixed scores. I was just telling them this was how it was. And it just felt increasingly unsatisfactory. And I think one of the things that really worried me was that this information felt privileged over other information. It felt scientific, it felt, there were numbers to it, and somehow those scores became the scores that everybody then thought about with the child. There's such a power in numbers. And I think when I look back, it's really interesting that my own children, when they were young, I never did the tests on them because I was aware that those numbers would stick in my head. Whatever they did, I would be thinking, oh, they're doing better than those numbers, or they're not doing as well as those numbers. But somehow that number would be in my head. I was also worried I was testing children to a point where they failed. So every time I met them, we went on to a point where they were struggling with whatever it was. And no matter how kindly I was in how I did it or how I reassured them, they and I knew they'd got to a point where they were stuck with the testing. I was also aware that some of the answers children gave me were brilliant answers, but I couldn't score them. So one young man, when I asked him what the 4 seasons of the year were, he told me football, rugby, swimming, tennis. And I had to give him nothing for that. And yet, what a brilliant answer. And I think there was one question, and it's so long since I've used the test, I'm not sure, but it was a question like, what is nothing? I can't remember exactly. And the boy told me it was a bag of mashins. And again, no points for bag of mashins, but he was telling me exactly what nothing meant. And I was aware that no matter how many qualifications I put when I wrote my report about the young person was very tired, or they weren't very comfortable seeing me, or they were distressed, whatever I said, those numbers still seemed to carry a weight and a privilege. And at times I was having to report very low scores to parents who'd sat and waited for me to do these amazing tests for their children. And I was telling them, giving them these scores, and there was nothing we could do with them because there was a sense this was fixed, this was the information about the child that couldn't be changed. And it was just devastating. And that has still lived with me. And that's a long time since I've done that. And I was very aware that the tests, although they were said to be culture free, they didn't take account of children's backgrounds, their previous experiences, the opportunities they might have had, the stresses they might have been under, all those other things, and that anxiety they might have felt just sitting with a complete stranger, perhaps somebody they'd met once or twice, but certainly somebody they didn't know as well as the other adults in their lives. And we know we don't do our best when we're under stress. So just that sense that how many things were not being taken into account when doing these tests. And I think my thinking that, so I'd done that for a year. I then went off to study for my master's, and my thinking changed enormously, not because of the course, but because of somebody else who was on the course with me. And he'd also done a year as an assistant psychologist, and he was just a man of such wisdom and such deep thinking. And what he said was, when I go into school, I take a pad of paper, I take a pencil, and I listen. I just take myself and I listen. And I kept that in my mind as we were doing the course. And the more I thought about psychometrics and the way we test children, the more what he was saying resonated with me.
Why did I remove psychometrics from my practice? When I did my initial training to be an educational psychologist in 1999, ever since that year of training, psychometrics never formed part of my assessment practice. Instead, I used the assessment through teaching model, which I'd been versed in as an assistant Senko in the West Midlands. And I also placed privilege on the value of language and collaborative discussion with a variety of stakeholders, being able to effect new meaning for children to bring about positive change. I felt that through discussion, we were able to elicit more of a deeper understanding about the systemic and contextualised aspects of learning for that child that would then be used to develop new systems or inform new pathways for intervention. I was concerned about the moral and the ethical arguments around calculation of cognitive scores to formulate conceptions of intelligence. And I feel that they've been used in the past to bad effect. And this has been highlighted in the BBC documentary that was aired earlier this year, which was called Subnormal, A British Scandal, where children and young people from particular ethnic and cultural groups were denied the opportunity to attend their local educational provision. So these kinds of patterns of behaviour and these processes would actually serve to make the inequalities in society even more pronounced. Finally, there are problems and tensions inherent with any concept of intelligence, which denotes itself to be one thing that we can pin down and measure, when we know it's a hypothetical construct made up of various elements with cross-cultural differences in terms of the importance of how the various elements might be conceived. So a measure of reactive time tests in a cognitive assessment battery, for example, might not be a quality that's privileged in different cultures outside of the Western culture, perhaps a generalisation. We need to look at all individuals' circumstances. But slow speed, reflective thinking might be valued or prized more highly than being able to think quickly on your feet, etc. Similarly, creativity might be valued in terms of informing the workplace, and that is also another quality of intelligence, as is social intelligence, being able to relate to people. Those things aren't necessarily being measured by cognitive assessment tests.
There is one other thing that I've been reflecting on while I've been thinking about what I would be saying for this recording, and just reflecting with my own children really on the impact a stranger has on your life as a school child. So that sense that one of my children can still remember the health visitor coming, and that pressure to perform, that pressure to stack bricks and say your name. And she's an adult now, and she still remembers what that felt like. One of my children can remember somebody coming and following them for the day. And then at the end of the day, there's no feedback about, didn't really know what that was about. None of us really know what on earth that was about. But that sense, and no feedback at the end, no sense of, oh, well, I was noticing this, or, oh, I was just because I'd been asked to follow a pupil. We don't know, but that sense of an adult being present and a child then not having any sort of right of redress or a right to understand why that's going on. And I just, or the school nurse comes in and you're weighed and you're measured and there are knowing looks across between the adults, you remember that. And I still remember going to the optician when I was very young, and my mum and the optician exchanging a glance, and I still don't know what that was about, and it still makes me feel very self-conscious about my vision. But these things happen, and so it's not neutral. And I remember the first time I ever observed a little boy. So I was sitting in a nursery. I was a very new assistant educational psychologist, and I got my notebook and I was watching what he was doing around the nursery, and it was great fun. I loved watching him and I loved being at that nursery. But by the end of the session, he'd pulled up a little chair and he was sitting looking at me. So he knew what I was doing. He knew what I was there to do, and he was watching me, and it was quite uncomfortable having somebody doing that. So I learned lots from that. And I think what's so lovely about the way we work is we try and be in the background wherever possible. We make sure that we are giving people a voice. And I'm always asking, and what does the young person think? And we need to make sure they are central, but we are not necessarily the best placed person to do that.
Now, the system when I joined in 1975 was that in the office there was a woman who was a clinical medical officer, and she was the senior, and she was responsible for the SPS as well, the school psychological service. So the principal educational psychologist was answerable to the school doctors. The school doctors did their own Stanford Binet test, which was the sort of early IQ test, and sometimes they didn't bother to refer to us. They did the IQ test, they got a low score, by low I mean under 70, and they would then mark their records, this child is educationally subnormal, and they'd tell the parent the child had to go to a special school, told the local authority, and the child was moved. Sometimes they wanted us to be involved as well, so we had a referral from the CMOs, and we did an assessment, and of course they expected an IQ test, and with the same result. There was a judgment made not by the psychologist, not by a panel or anything, by the clinical medical officers to move the child into a special school. So it was a tool that was used to decide, to triage basically, to decide who was going to go into special school. And that's what I walked into when I first came to Nottinghamshire. And of course, I conformed. I mean, you do when you're young, you've been trained in that way. There was a big element of how you do an IQ test in my EP training, so I did it. And I was never happy with it. I was bored stiff with them. I thought it was pretty pointless. I hated not being able to do a bit of trial teaching or give feedback to the child. I thought it was unfair. I didn't know what the child was taking away from it. I knew they were anxious. I also knew that if I got a score, that everybody forgot everything else I was saying and paid attention to the score on the page. And however much I interpreted that, it was really the number that screamed out at people. So if it was 70 or 50 or whatever they were saying, this child shouldn't be here in mainstream. If I was saying, oh, well, this child has a lot of potential, it's got a patchy score, and, they then interpret that as the child being lazy. Well, if they're as bright as you're saying they are, Andy, why aren't they performing better? And then there's get all punitive and blame the child. And remember, we had very much a medical model of within child problems. So it wasn't about adapting the curriculum or teaching styles. If your child was sitting in the class and he wasn't performing, then there was something wrong with him. That was the mindset of a lot of parents and teachers. And I was contributing to that. So I gradually moved away from testing, but it took a long time. It probably took me about 10 years. That was my personal journey. And I phased out. I stopped using psychometrics because I felt they weren't the best use of my time. They didn't give me enough information about the child. There are other ways, child teaching in particular. And people misread it. They misused the data. And I didn't want to be complicit in something that was probably wrong.
The context in terms of my own training practice, my own supervisor on my training course was somebody who did use nothing other than psychometrics. And I remember being on placement with him and wondering whether I'd actually come to the right profession, because it didn't do what I wanted to see how I saw myself as an educational psychologist. And so when I started, the first things I did was I bought a load of kids' toys and I filled my car boot with them, and I used those as the process by which I would do my assessments, particularly with younger children. I did use some intelligence tests because I felt that was what was expected and required. But the more I became embedded in the service, the more I realized that I didn't have to. Nobody was requiring me to.